Yes. Hello. Welcome, everybody, to our monthly, actually number 9th already, online PoSoCoMeS seminar on recent publications in memory studies. And the seminar series is organized by the PoSoCoMeS, which is the working group on post-socialist and comparative memory studies at the Memory Studies Association. My name is Anastasia Felker, and this time we are discussing the book authored by Stephan Jaeger that is entitled The Second World War in a 21st Century Museum. And if you look into the chat, you will see the link to the book, so it is open access. Our seminars are usually designed as a conversation, as a discussion between the discussant or reviewer and the author. So I will now very briefly introduce our discussant, who will be also chairing today's session. And this is Daniel B. Reynolds, who is a professor in modern languages in the German department at Grinnell College, Iowa, in the US. His recent book, Postcards from Auschwitz, that was published by the NYU Press in 2018, explores the relationship between tourism and Holocaust remembrance. His other research interests include German literature and culture from the late 19th century to the present, with special emphasis on the Weimar Republic, East Germany, the history and culture of Berlin, and last but not least, German colonialism and the genocide of the Nama and Hebrew people in today's Namibia, a former German colony. And our authors today is Stephan Jaeger, who is professor of German studies at the Department of German and Slavic Studies of the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada. Sorry, let me keep admitting people. His research interests include, among other, of course, museum narratives and experience, relations between literature and historiography and history, poetics and narratology of historical writing, representation of war and the Holocaust. Professor Jaeger published extensively on the representation of violence in museums and memorials across the globe, and his current research project further develops the concept of experientiality that we are going to be discussing today, of course, for the analysis of museums. Professor Reynolds, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss Stephan's recent book, and I will provide some initial comments about the book, and then hopefully perhaps flagging a few questions that Stephan would be willing to answer, and then I think we'll open it up to a conversation, which I look forward to having, because as we were saying before the conference, the meeting officially began, there's a lot more to discuss then the book taps into some major phenomena that I think we're all aware of and would like to discuss. So I will begin just by commenting on the timeliness of this book, but also the remarkable nature of the phenomenon of World War II museums in the expansion in the numbers of World War II museums. I think as somebody who comes from the field of Holocaust studies and Holocaust remembrance, I'm familiar with thinking about the so-called memory boom in Holocaust museums. For me, the World War II museum in some ways is a more surprising phenomenon for different reasons, partly because of the disparate nature of World War II memory, depending on the location. But you've mentioned, just to name three recent examples, the Empirical Museum in London is opening or has opened this year a new expanded exhibition with a gallery dedicated to the Holocaust. We'll hopefully talk at some point about the relationship between World War II museums and Holocaust memorials and museums also. But also another recent example is the World War II Museum in Gdańsk in Poland that's been open since 2017. And in 2009, the World War II Museum in New Orleans in the United States, which has undergone a major expansion. So I think for my first question I would like to flag for Stephan to reflect on is simply to talk in general about the timing. Why are we seeing this phenomenon of increased memorialization of World War II? Can we reduce it to something like, does it have some of the same causal features that we see in Holocaust remembrance, for example, the end of the Cold War era, for example, or the awareness that eyewitnesses are passing away, and that what we will be left with is recorded memory and not lived memory. The book, I'll just give a brief summary of the structure of the book and highlight what I think is the work that Stephan does in the book. In chapter 1, we are offered a very useful typology of museums ranging from the sort of narrative historical museum to the memorial museum. And this is a very helpful museum. I think one question that comes up just from perusing the table of contents, and it's a question I'm sure Stephan has anticipated and has an answer for, is, of course, World War II was a global event. So what do we do about the representation of the Asian experience in World War II museums? Is there a, what is the, why should we should that be treated as a separate phenomenon? Does it obey a temporality of memory than we see in the case of European museums of World War II remembrance? Is it about the current political climate that's happening in Europe today versus elsewhere around the planet? So I would welcome some reflections, some comments on on that choice of what to focus on. Of course, no book can write about everything, and so I hope that's just a question for us, a sort of contextualizing question. Of course, the major contribution of the book is presented in chapter 2, and that is the concept of experientiality. And of course, every museum visit is an experience. But what Stephan's book does so nicely is offer a sort of taxonomy for charting experientiality in museums. He offers us a set of types of museums that range from restricted experientiality, where the visitors encounter with the museum and the memories on display about World War II are guided by a fairly overwhelming narrative or a very singular narrative, often serving a nationalist orientation, to a more open-ended experiential form where the visitor's experience is an encounter with multiple perspectives, and thus enabling the visitor in some ways to step outside of a kind of immersive moment and instead have a critical relationship with the museum on display. I find this a question of experientiality fascinating, again, coming from the field of Holocaust studies, where the notion of experience, particularly in the realm of Holocaust tourism, where experientiality can be something of a taboo in Holocaust remembrance. In other words, I think there's a fairly widely shared understanding that the point of a visitor going to a concentration camp memorial, for example, is not to come away from the visit with any delusion that they have somehow an insight, a unique insight into the experience of the victims and survivors of the Holocaust, but rather that they should be aware of the temporal distance between themselves and the history of the Holocaust, and the fundamentally different nature of being a visitor in perfect safety, walking through a contemporary memorial as compared to a prisoner in a concentration camp almost 80 years ago. So on the other hand, I would say that said, obviously a visitor to a Holocaust memorial and museum is also undergoing an experience, and that experience needs to be accounted for. And so how do we account for those experiences? How do we understand the way that an experience of a museum can lead to insight, can lead to critical reflection, can alienate in productive or unproductive ways, is an important dimension, not just for World War II museums, but also for Holocaust museums. So I find this taxonomy of a sort of sliding scale of experientiality from mimetic to structural forms to be really useful. So Stephan's book offers us 4 types of experientiality. So the chapters, there are 12 chapters. Each chapter looks at 3 different World War II museums, and they're gathered according to the category of experientiality he sees as characterizing that museum. So the first set would include is restricted experientiality. And here I think the Warsaw Rising Museum is an example, as is the New Orleans World War II Museum. The next set of museums is museums that he describes as being structured around primary experientiality. The next set would be secondary experientiality. And there I would invite Stephan to just please characterize a little bit more for us the difference between these levels of experientiality and what, how does one discern one from the other? Is it a clear line that one can easily identify, or is it a matter of degree or of kind? And then, of course, the last category of museum that Stephan talks about is are museums dedicated to transnational memory. This last category may seem a somewhat outlier compared to the other 3 because we don't see the term experientiality reflected in the term. But I think that Stephan has a very good reason for including this at the other end of a spectrum that began with restricted experientiality. So I would just welcome some further comments on the inclusion of transnational memory as a type of experientiality. I think it's important to observe that Stephan's categories don't necessarily. I would say that the aim of the book is not to suggest a progression from sort of most traditional and problematic to most innovative and dynamic. There are strengths and weaknesses within each of the categories. So I think I would caution us not to see this book, the study, as necessarily, it's not normative in its approach. That said, I come away from the book feeling like the sort of hero of the narrative of Stephan's book is the World War II Museum, the Bundeswehr Military History Museum in Dresden, which Stephan has kindly showed us in his background today. And I think it is an example of secondary experientiality in the book. And it seems to me that it sets a certain standard for the ways that World War II museums might be conceptualized. And I wonder if Stephan would agree with that perception, or if that's something that I'm perhaps projecting onto the book. Really, the last 3 chapters of the book dealing with transnational memory help us focus on the fundamental choices that museums make about their core mission, about what they choose to include in their exhibition, questions about how they choose to frame the Holocaust in the context of World War II, whether it's treated as a separate event or as a related but secondary event somehow in comparison to the experience of World War II. Other questions include how do we deal with the suffering of civilians, and that includes civilians from aggressor nations versus occupied nations. What role do works of art play in World War II museums, and how do they supplement or critique or otherwise relate to the displays of artifacts and documents in the museums? Finally, how are visitors interpolated in these museums? What questions are posed to contemporary visitors to these museums in terms of thinking of themselves as visitors, but also in terms of the identificatory aspects of museum going? Are they invited to identify as victims, momentarily perhaps consider themselves as potential perpetrators or as bystanders? All of the above. These are some of the questions that museums are faced with, and often these questions can help us overcome overly simplistic or heroic narratives that are perhaps a feature in some World War II museums. I'll wrap up my own comments. I think one of the sort of methodological features of the book that Stephan innovates is this notion of the ideal visitor. And this is a way of approaching museums from a kind of phenomenological perspective that imagines a visitor without necessarily being grounded in empirical visitor research. It's akin to the implied reader of a literary text. How does the museum seem to construct the reader or address the visitor or address the visitor coming to the museum? What assumptions does the museum make about the ideal visitor, and what can we imagine as the critical potential of the ideal visitor coming to a museum? I am both drawn to this notion of the ideal visitor and struggle with it because I think it's important not to universalize visitors to museums, as Stephan acknowledges in his book. Everybody comes to museums from a different point of view, from a different perspective. We're interpolated by history as into different roles as we go to museums. And so in what ways do we account for widely shared phenomena of visitors without falling into a trap of overly universalizing the ideal visitor? I'm sure that's a question that Stephan has thought about as well. So again, I think the book is very successful in offering us a way of approaching and categorizing visitor experience. This notion of experientiality is potentially very productive. I do hope that in the course of conversation, we'll hear more about what some of the successes, but also some of the pitfalls are of relying on experientiality in museums. And maybe a final question would be, by paying attention to experientiality as a category of analyzing museums, are we giving up on the reading of the narrative that is presented at museums? In other words, however the narrative may be presented, there is always a narrative on display or multiple narratives on display. Does the category of experientiality let us critique the specific narratives? Or is that an additional project that that is aided by perhaps the notion of experientiality? But do we, as critics of museums, also need to pay very close attention to the specifics of the narrative, regardless of its form on display in museums? So I'll stop there and welcome Stephan's responses, and then we'll open it up to more of a conversation. So thank you.
Right, thank you, Dan. That was really, kind of insightful. I mean, I will struggle probably to answer everything, at least in the kind of time frame, because there are many kind of, great kind of thoughtful and maybe a little bit provocative questions in here. Definitely important if we think about the museum representation of World War II or of war and violence more in genocide, more in general today. For the first question you had, so why World War II now? I don't want to spend too much time on it, because I actually think that is something which we might better want to discuss with the whole audience, because I know, I mean, one of the admittedly justified criticisms I constantly get, why these 12 museums? Are you not too westernized in a way? And having, I have 3 museums from Poland. as my Eastern European example, and 3 museums from Germany, and the rest is then in Belgium, the UK, and Canada, and the US. So, which admittedly clearly is the case. So in a way, so you could absolutely expand it, but then you would probably, add further memory contexts, which I'm not necessarily an expert in, like the one in Asia, which clearly, I mean, it has a different trajectory, but there are quite considerable experts which work on the Camphor women and how they are remembered, what political tensions come out of it, obviously on the aspect of perpetration for Japan, and how that is told or not told in a way in kind of museum representation. I think the trajectory is different, and I think you would probably just, I mean, for a one-person book, it would just get too much to include this full global aspect. So I have tried to give it on certain times, but in the end, Poland is my kind of representative for Central Eastern Europe beyond Germany. And I mean, everything else I felt, although I looked at the number of Eastern European museums, would be too much. I mean, like going to Russia or to Ukraine in a way. And of course, museums are also at different times. I think there is the boom we have. I mean, obviously, on the one hand, we have the museum boom and memorial boom, which people can just see in a way in the last 20 plus years. And World War II is kind of part of that. Then you have the question in a way, how much is World War II or the Holocaust or both in how they are intertwined, a part of a European identity? Does that split a Western and an Eastern European identity or not? That all has a lot to do. Then, of course, there are nations, which the UK or the US would be, or Canada would be good examples too, who were on the other side, where World War II is a major kind of narrative boosting in a way. I mean, for Canada, it's basically a nation building narrative in a way, and that's part of why World War II comes up again and again and can't be left out. And of course, Germany has its specific history with dealing with perpetration, with its own victimhood, but also with perpetration relatively early. And that kind of is reflected in how the research went, and in the end, how public memory and public history go. I mean, I just actually last week had a discussion in Berlin where I was saying, I don't really understand why the German kind of parliament has just kind of decided that they need a documentation center on World War II and the German occupied territories, with all what they already have in a way in kind of representing World War II. But it is whatever happens out of that project, it shows you it's not ending. So in a way, and I think in Eastern Europe, we see a lot of movement in a way to new museums from very different angles, depending on where the cultural memory of different nations is at this moment. So that's maybe for the general kind of why the phenomenon now. I think the phenomenon will go on. So in 10 years, you have to write, or I have to write, or somebody else hopefully writes another book that tries to systematize World War II museums in relation to museum representation and also the Holocaust and other narratives. So the question of experientiality, so my key term. So yes, I mean, I obviously listened very carefully. You said on the one hand, the Dresden Military History Museum appears, or the Bundeswehr Military History Museum in Dresden appears as my hero, which is probably true to an extent, because I find a lot of exciting examples how it opens up discourse in a way. It brings whatever. I mean, my opening example from this museum is a kind of toy tank as part of a toy parade in a way, which automatically becomes, on the one hand, an object of victimhood, since it was kind of destroyed during the bombing of Dresden. On the other hand, it's obviously immediately presented as a perpetrator in a way for what happened in Eastern Europe. And it creates a fairly complex narrative through one object. And that's just the strength of this museum in a way that it allows in a way for intertwined and entangled kind of memories on so many levels. And that makes it possibly a little bit of a hero. At the same time, I also argue, as you pointed indirectly out, that one of the weaknesses of the Dresden Museum is that it offers too much. So its narrative in the end is potentially to many visitors not clear enough, and then there might be simply not enough orientation. And even if I mean, just as an example, if I am able to connect as a researcher numerous dots, how the armament industry and the Holocaust and the German war effort are connected, that doesn't mean that 99% of visitors would have any chance to do that, because it is just presented to them and they had to do the links. So clearly there is some real empirical criticism of the museum that it's confusing at times. So that's why I would be careful to call it the hero in a way. I think it brings out certain themes, which I have under my category of secondary experientiality, but at the same time, that doesn't mean, there are great museums like, the Warsaw Rising Museum. It is a great museum if you look at it purely from if you forget about what your opinion is, your own ideological background and your goals about museums, and if you just look, how do they bring their narrative across? It's all, it's a great museum. It does it very efficiently of telling in a way of bringing, I call it manipulating the visitor into a certain narrative. And that's why there's less room, and that's why it's restricted experientiality, but it's still a very efficient representation. And that goes also for a museum like the New Orleans Museum of World War, the American Museum, National Museum of World War II, which is technologically one of the most advanced war museums in the world. And it uses this kind of technology in a very effective way. So that's why I wouldn't say there's I think the experientiality as a category tries to work. We put the visitor in a position, so the visitor becomes in a way a consciousness that can walk through the exhibition and fill potentialities. And some might not use the experiential potential of the exhibition. Some use it a bit, and some visitors use it a lot. So that's in a way, and that works. If it's restricted, then of course there's an overlayer in a way of a strong narrative that could be nationalistic or antagonistic, depending on how you call it. But it can also be an activist narrative or a cosmopolitan human rights narrative or so, which dominates. And again, it might not give that much room for experiential experiences. So that's in a way the thing. And if I talk about primary experientiality, I basically mean that the narrative of the museum focuses on reproducing, usually not merely individual narratives, but collective narratives. So for example, the museum in New Orleans has, it has really a very clear perspective that is a collective perspective of the American soldier, not really named, walking into the war, experiencing the war, walking through the war. And we have a side perspective, which is the American public in a way, and that is basically performed in the museum or narrated. That's why I say it's primary, because of course it's constructed too, totally, in a way, but it is kind of, but a constructed perspective. An interesting new example, which is of course not in the book, would be the Jewish Museum in Berlin with its new exhibition from last year, where they kind of were praised for basically creating the Jewish, basically more or less ignoring, not having any perpetrator documents and creating in a way a perspective from the perspective of the Jewish people in Germany, how they felt, should we emigrate or not, when should we flee, and then we have to flee, but we can't. And it's so it's this kind of collective gaze which brings the whole thing together. That's primary experientiality too. So in a way, actually a very well done one in a way for the perspective, since it's not easy to do this form for Holocaust, or for, in this case, a Holocaust section or a World War II section. So, and then we have what I call secondary experientiality, which I have in the Dresden Museum, in the topography of terror. Also, it exists in a number. These things are really not normative, as Dan said. So, you get all forms of experientiality, and you get the restrictions in Dresden too. So in a way, so if you look in a way for certain narratives, so you get them in all of the museums. But secondary experientiality simply means what we identify is not something that has really happened in the past. So as I just said, if we take the element of mourning, which is a big topic in Dresden, then you have different strategies talking about mourning or representing mourning throughout the exhibition. And that basically is a structure we are taking as visitor, and we can potentially connect. It's not a perspective for a certain group in a way has just kind of had the feeling of mourning. It's something which we see basically as a structure. Or the other one, which is more abstract, would be what I just mentioned with the armament industry connected to the German industry, the Holocaust, the war effort. That's not, clearly that is historical by reconstructing structures, but it's nobody's perspective. It's clearly something which goes beyond that. That's where the difference between primary and secondary. But it is fluid. I mean, it could be in a way, it could be really different from museum to museum. So let me just look. So what I think, I mean, important to point out with experientiality is it's not simply experience. So I think I try in the book to make very clear if, I mean, traditional museum display, you put a visitor into the basement, in a way, there are a few mannequins and a little scene, and then it all, I mean, it becomes very loud, and you are supposed to feel like in a cellar that is bombed from any perspective of a civilian, whether German or Belgium or whatever. So in a way, that's not experientiality. That's simply a version of trying to create a very kind of direct experience, a very mimetic experience. Experientiality is really looking at the potential experiences, the potential structures and narratives a visitor can find in a museum. And some exhibitions offer more of that. Some exhibitions are clearly either they are so distant that they are just documenting and they are not letting the visitor close enough. That's actually the typical German kind of mode of representing World War II and the Holocaust. So you are not getting close enough. You're getting one explanation after the other. It's kind of very educational. There's no experience in there at all, and certainly not experientiality. The other one is the one we just discussed. If you are kind of very, I mean, if you stage a lot and perform a lot, like for Eastern Europe, like you have in the House of Terror in Budapest or so, mainly obviously to post-war narrative, then in a way, or I mean, one actually I looked for this session, I looked again how the kind of exhibition in Lidice works in a way in creating a kind of atmosphere of evil of the Nazis. And it's very atmospheric and in that sense very effective, but it doesn't give much choice to the visitor. They have to experience in a way these kind of dark shades of the exhibition, and in this case of Heydrich coming to Prague, and in the end, in a way, what happens in Lidice because of the assassination of Heydrich. So this is in a way somewhere the visitor doesn't have much room. So in a way that I wouldn't call experiential, that's restricted experientiality. It might be very well done from a representative point of view, but it doesn't give the visitor much room. So this is basically the level. And then the last thought about the transnational, I agree, it's a different category, but it's not part of this. So that's why I have said that in a way I analyze under the transnational, the museum in Gdansk, the Second World War Museum, the House of European History in Brussels, and the German-Russian Museum in Karlshorst. I think all of them have their restrictions in a way. Karlshorst obviously is a political one that they kind of Russians and Germans need to organize the museum together. The one in Brussels I read as the most restrictive one because in the end it becomes almost a universal voice. So the Holocaust, in 5 words, is part of total war. And it can't really become, and then in the end, Holocaust memory becomes something universal too, and all nations seem to remember it in the same way. So that makes it very restricted, obviously. The one in Gdansk is obviously much more complicated also because there are 2 versions of it, one more open one more restrictive one, but even the original one without Polish government interference has on the one hand a strong narrative, which is putting Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union as two aggressors, and that goes through, and the countries that are perpetrators are part of a narrative where the visitor hasn't much choice than accepting it. But on the other hand, it has a lot of openings where this kind of narrative breaks up and the transnational, the comparative approaches come through. So that's in a way shows you in a little bit how the transnational is basically an extra category that helps us understanding these three levels of experientiality. And then maybe on the last question on the visitors, yes, I mean, my book is working with aesthetic response theory and the originally narratological category of experientiality. So it's about the potentiality of exhibitions. And it clearly, one can argue, I mean, I spent, I don't know, 80 hours, 100 hours in Dresden. Obviously, no visitor will probably spend more than 2 or 3 hours. So I get to a potentiality a normal visitor would never have. And I think that this is something that doesn't mean I want to create a real visitor. I want to just show the potential of the exhibition. And then we could, as a next step, which was too much for the book, look, are there experiential ways? How would we analyze it? I mean, would we interview visitors? Do we have to follow visitors and see what they are really focusing on, and then do targeted post-visit interviews with them? Because of the pandemic, actually, I did finally some real empirical research on TripAdvisor responses to the topography of terror and the Caserne d'Auzun in Mechelen in Belgium to figure out, in a way, do my ideas about experientiality in those museums, is that in any way, can we find that in any way in the kind of exhibitions? And on the one hand, in these kind of TripAdvisor responses, and the answer is, I think we do. I mean, up to a point. I mean, you can't go beyond a certain point, but the interesting thing was the museum, which I interpret as a strong structural experientiality, because the topography of terror uses photo montages in a way, and collages and clusters to create topics like humiliations, watching or observing crimes in a way through the German public. One interesting, the cluster people love the most is the kind of the so-called cluster of laughter, or people basically smiling while they're committing atrocities, or in the kind of, and you can see in the TripAdvisor responses, although the museum isn't doing any didactic work in making this, they just present it basically in these montages, and it comes up. So these clusters come up in a way in the TripAdvisor responses quite massively. What doesn't come up, for example, are the historians' quotes, which were part of my interpretation. So you can see it's much more, some things might be better than others in a way for a wide audience in a way. And of course, it depends on the exact audiences, but one can show. And then my alternative example, the Caserne d'Auzun, shows that, which is very didactic, which basically brings home the idea that we, bullying, discrimination in a way, the starting of the Holocaust is transferable in a human rights model to other kind of genocides and human rights violations. And it really brings this home. It's a very strong didactic. In that sense, it's a mix out of an open museum and a restricted museum, but it has a strong didactic. And interestingly, the TripAdvisor reviewers of the topography of terror have much more interesting ideas what it means, what they see in the present for their own lives, for the present and future, than the ones in d'Auzun, who basically just repeat the keywords that they have seen in the museum. So that would speak for the fact that experientiality is not totally off as if we look at real visitors. But of course, it's not an empirical tool. It's a tool which operates somewhere between curation and representation on the one hand, and then trying to make the visitor category as a category stronger. I think I think we should open it up for discussion now, unless Dan has obviously a direct comment.
Yeah, no, I'll just say that I appreciate your comments about empirical visitor research, and I also think that it has a place, but I also think that what we can learn from it is probably very limited, unless we are going to do longitudinal studies of massive numbers of visitors. But then, even then, I'm not sure what we have gained in terms of understanding about how museums work, because I think you know, to read museums, I mean, you need the interpretive strategies that we cultivate in the humanities, I think in particular, to look at the way that museums communicate and use imagery and use space. I think that you know, and a visitor's experience 5 minutes after the visit may not be their takeaway 10 years later, when they think, after they've done some additional reading about the event that they've observed. So I don't see it at all as a shortcoming to not be based on empirical visitor research, although I think it's interesting when you can go to TripAdvisor and see those kinds of corroborations. I think they're very productive. But yeah, I would like to open it up for Q&A, and I think invite the audience to raise their hands. I think that's the under reactions. Is that the no? It's not react. Yeah, there's a raise hand button under the reactions function. So if anybody would like to pose a question. You know, and maybe one discussion we could begin with is the one that at the very beginning, the question of why are these museums becoming so prevalent? Why are we experiencing a memory boom in World War II museum construction? And so I'll just maybe you and I can talk, Stephan, and I just invite anybody who has a question to please just press a button, and I will be happy to interrupt ourselves and give you the floor, because I want this to be an inclusive conversation. But you know, I was I guess very recently the relationships between Poland and Germany have taken a rather sour turn of late, and with kind of a recirculation of discourses of victimization and aggression, you know, framing Germany as the aggressor and Poland as the victim, which of course has a basis in history, but it also is serving a particular present day political agenda. And it's fascinating to me to see the way that World War II memory is being mobilized. And I do wonder if there is a kind of a unique experience, not just of Poland, but an Eastern European perspective about World War II and the decades that followed World War II that we need to account for, perhaps separately from the nature of Holocaust and World War II memory in the West.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also kind of, please chip in anybody who is kind of working on museums or representations or even cultural memories of other Eastern European countries, because as I said, I'm not an expert for all museum representations, but my feeling is that there is the case of the kind of Museum of the Second World War in Gdansk is quite typical in a certain sense for what's going on in Eastern Europe, because on the one hand, you have this big clash of an approach that tries to be more European, more inclusive. I mean, that advertised itself as the first museum in a way in the world, which kind of has this inclusive approach in a way of basically representing everything about the war. And then, of course, we have the very strong counter narrative that basically tries to utilize, I mean, first of all, to break down why would we even do that in a way of the current Polish government, and then tries to utilize it in a way into a much more heroic Polish story where the kind of international, transnational side doesn't have a place. And I think this is something which is happening not just in Poland. And of course, it happens in any international context. So just to say, even the German side, which always seems to be more documentary also, but it's super interesting if you have the time to look at the kind of documentation center for flight expulsion and reconciliation in Berlin, which opened this summer. Where many people in Poland were quite afraid of what would open there, and in a way, I think I don't think you have to be afraid of what it's doing, but it still tries to tell, it has a weird cut. So on the one hand, it does a universal story of refugees and flights, which works to an extent. It's not bad in a way as a representation. So there I would actually find some elements of structural experientiality. But on the other hand, it tries an almost straight linear story of the flight and expulsion. But yes, there are the kind of the expulsion of Polish people and of other Eastern European nations dimensions. I have a case here or there, but in the end, it becomes an almost linear narrative from World War II is clearly accepted as a reason why all that happens, but then it disappears in a choir of suffering in a way, which is unfortunate. And I think they could have fairly easily done it differently, but it shows you that these tensions are still there. So the question is it then satisfying in an inter-European context? For what party is it satisfying? In a way, if you bring a school group in, I don't know. Most people of a school group probably don't even know what flight and expulsion means. So they might be much more interested in hearing about young people fleeing from Syria also, because they can connect to that story. So it's very complex in a way how these things are played out, even in the German context where you have 40 years or more of kind of working through memory. And I think then you have the same things, as I said, in all Eastern European countries, you have, I don't know all, but many, you have these strong political battles about memory going on. And that shows museums are quite politicized, but we have.
Yeah, it looks like Misha has a question.
Just to break the ice, maybe, and show others that it is possible to ask questions. So I guess I have two interconnected questions. And the first part is about the extent to which what you're talking about is really new. And I'm thinking specifically about the idea of offering a dimension of experientiality in war museums, right? If we think back to military museums in the 19th century, then, at least from the end of the 19th century, there was a strong movement towards sort of offering experientiality by using new methods of museum formation. I'm thinking specifically of dioramas and monumental panoramas, which were all the rage in the late 19th and early 20th century. And coming from a background of Russian and Soviet history, that was hugely important in late imperial Russia in the form of giant battle panoramas that were supposed to allow visitors to really immerse themselves in important battles. And this was then taken up in the early Soviet Union in the first attempts to memorialize the Civil War, and then created a whole tradition which exists to this day, and which now is being exported to lots of countries in the global South and Southeastern Europe, of creating these dioramas. There's even a specialized studio of military artists that was created in 1934 and is still active, and has specialized in creating these things, everything from gigantic paintings to panoramas and dioramas. And they're hugely successful. They have lots of commissions from, everywhere from Macedonia to African countries. So I'm wondering about the extent to which what you're describing and what is now, of course, implemented using very modern, sophisticated technologies really has precedence in the history of military museums. And the second part of that question is about national traditions. And I mean, you've talked about this quite a bit, and the reasons for selecting the countries that you chose to focus on, etc. But still, I'm wondering whether looking at some other countries, and obviously, once again, my expertise is in the Soviet Union, but also maybe East Asian countries and others, would maybe change the story that you're telling, because to use the Soviet examples, I mean, in the Soviet Union there have been museums of what is called the Great Patriotic War, so the Second World War, since before the war ended, right? There's a wonderful dissertation that was defended recently in Basel about the creation of the first Soviet war museums in during the war in both the capitals and also provincial regions of the Soviet Union, and they've been there all along, using some of these elements that I mentioned, panoramas, dioramas, but also all sorts of other stuff. And they never had the idea that it's all just about kind of neutral education. It was always about experientiality. And I'm sure that lots of other countries, outside of the core Western countries, also have rich traditions of, kind of overwhelming visitors with that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering whether, to maybe exaggerate it a little bit, what you're describing is almost Western countries kind of catching up with a global trend that is much older.
Well, that's a wonderful question. In a way, or kind of nicely polemically kind of concluded at the end. I love that. I mean, first of all, Misha, thanks for the historical dimension you bring in. Obviously, yes, I mentioned some, for the museums that are not brand new, I mentioned in a way some predecessor exhibitions in my book, but it's not a book about kind of the historical development of World War II exhibitions. That would be another question. So let me think about that. So in a way, on the one hand, I would say, okay, in a way, I think you almost, with experientiality, I would say as a kind of conclusion, what is important is in a way, or what I would argue is that in the German context, that museums who are basically saying, oh, experience is bad, so we just have to get a kind of scientific, distant kind of narrative, we document everything in a way, that's a mistake in a way, because it will leave the visitor, they might get a lot of context, but they will not engage as strongly in an exhibition. That's why we need elements of experientiality. However, I would not go as far as saying that a panorama by itself is experientiality. So I think it could be, depending on how it is kind of staged in a way. So I think, in a way, to get the kind of experience where you have different potentialities and where you don't just simply give mainly one narrative, whether it's a relatively clear idea why the Great Patriotic War in a way was fought and what this kind of means, or whether it's a celebration of war through kind of museum objects and so on. I think you need a combination of things, and that comes out of it. So it can't be plain narrative story. It can't be objects per se. Elements of immersion, whether it's structural or real immersion, need to be kind of part of that I make very clear. And I think there's a connection to your question. But I also think in a way that museums, to tell multiple stories, to allow kind of people to have kind of feel the kind of tensions in narrative, or to explore different angles of history, it would be more than that. So I'm not sure, panoramas exist in the German museum world too. If you follow whatever, the Pergamon panorama we have now, or something like that. So I'm not sure this is 100% about really totally different traditions. The interesting thing is, I would say, if you have a panorama, you run the risk that you don't have enough contextualization. So with the complexities of World War II in the 21st century, you probably simplify, because you are looking, yes, you have the overview about a historic scene, and it would probably be that, but we don't understand the structure. So it would very much focus on historical events. That's not what I mean with experientiality. What I mean with experientiality is really that you can get into either collective perspectives, into structures in a way through a very wide range. And then the question is that restricted because there is an ideological narrative behind it, whether it's Europeanism or a very kind of patriotic idea of one country. And so that's where I would call it the difference. At the same time, I think it's totally justified, and it is probably, I mean, if we look at aesthetic representational means, these things are important, and it would be, yeah, it's interesting. Unlike the German tradition, which again went because of the Holocaust to totally documenting being distant, here you have a tradition that is very aesthetic. So in a way, and that I think brings it together, and we could look at it more. I had to look at it more in detail to understand. In a way, do we meet here or have here a panorama that is basically a static scene, or do we really understand history and its structure through it? And then if that's the case, then it would be quickly becoming something which would be primary or secondary experientiality in a very dynamic, multi-perspective sense. So I think maybe that contextualized.
I just want to quickly add on to that and then turn it over to Anastasia, who has a question. But I would also note that panoramas are also multimedia experiences. They come with spoken narratives, with overlaid images, sometimes with music that's meant. So there is a way in which they are more immersive. And my colleague in German here at Grinnell, Vance Bird, has done some work on the Civil War panorama in Atlanta, which has been restored with a new narrative that's really meant to highlight the experience of Black American voices and perspectives on the Civil War. So yeah, I think it's interesting.
If I can say one more thing, because I don't think I have stressed that, I think that would be creating exactly where Misha, depending on what kind of panorama it is. So I think my argument is experientiality. The visitor moves into a museum space and then has to make this museum space basically their own in a way through the kind of thing. So it really depends. Are you looking statically at a panorama, or like the one which exists from the kind of Soviet Union and Karlshorst, where there's a little bit of action, but it's really a static kind of view for the, or is it something that would emotionally, that's what Dan just said, in a way, so that the visitor basically feels as part of the panorama, and you don't have the static observer position. That would change it and immediately become super interesting in comparing what I have shown for the different museums. So it really, yeah, it's a great question in a way about aesthetic representation.
Yeah, please, Anastasia, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I do have two rather short questions. When I was preparing for this seminar, I was making a list of the theoretical sort of frameworks through which that are present in the book. And if I'm not mistaken, those would be transnational, agonistic, antagonistic, cosmopolitan, to a lesser extent, global memory. And then, if I'm not mistaken, in chapter first, you mentioned, Stephan, that you do analyze 12 museums in that book, but you visited something like 157. And as of course, an impressive number of museums. And I was wondering whether I was, I was trying to further understand this concept of experientiality. Would you say that this concept, as a theoretical framework as well, would be applicable to all of the museums, that we can look, that is a helpful lens through which we can take a look on each and every museum beyond, of course, those like 12, and also with your experience of visiting, I'm sure that it's much more than 157 right now, although with the pandemic, you can never know. In comparison with those theoretical frameworks and lenses that are already omnipresent in almost every work on memory studies. And then I do have a second one. I was really surprised within your conclusion. You describe an exhibition in Essen, if I'm not mistaken, from 2018 and 19 that was called War, Power, and Meaning, that was trying to apply agonistic approach. And then they were showing the extremists marching through Dresden with the posters saying bombing Holocaust could not be forgotten, if I'm not mistaken. I was wondering, because to me it is an astonishing example of other side of universalizing the Holocaust and the uses of the Holocaust. And I was wondering whether you met it somewhere else in all those more than 157 museums. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a great question too. So I think the first question, up to a point, yes. I mean, I mean, of course, you have to fine tune it, but I think if a museum has enough kind of elements of aesthetic representation and narrative, it is probably interesting to look at it through the lens of experientiality. I mean, just to give you a counter example, I mean, one of the museums I saw was in Luxembourg. I don't even have to give necessarily the name, and one of the castles there. That was just, I mean, a museum without any museum didactics. It was, I mean, as if somebody had thrown, in a way, all possible memorabilia you can find of Americans in that battle, which was in that city, with other stuff in one room and one tower, and that was it. So in a way, I would say, okay, there probably any representational theory just fails and says, okay, we need some narrative. We need some structure here. In a way, we need obviously a contextual analysis, what is represented. So otherwise we are just in an antiquarian storage. So there it doesn't work. So, but I would say in general, yes. I mean, if you have this kind of tension between historical context, narrative, experience / experientiality, you can apply it, and you will, the sliding scale between restricted primary and secondary will probably help in a way understanding what options, what potential does a visitor have in a museum. As I said, some museums might want a restricted experientiality, and that's totally okay within the kind of memory context they are working in. And of course, as a scholar, you can analyze it then, but so not every museum curator would go for structural or secondary experientiality. There's no doubt about that. But I think, yes, it could work. For the one in Essen, yes. So the Essen one it's a great, I mean, so obviously the concept of agonistic memory in a way as a solution, in a way kind of overcoming antagonistic and cosmopolitan memory is, it's very interesting for World War II and the Holocaust, and has been kind of developed in that way as well. And the Essen exhibition was supposed to be the practical proof. I mean, in the end, I think the researchers doing this admitted that they failed up to an extent. They created actually a very interesting exhibition, but they were not able to show perpetration the way they wanted. And that's one of the interesting things in a way with World War II. How can you show perpetration? Just as a structure, in a way, as something that comes in a way anonymous or as a collective? And you go into, how can you go into stories of perpetrators? How close can you get to the perspective of a perpetrator? And obviously there are limitations depending on how you do it. And they, in the end, chose surprisingly, in a way, to leave it almost out. They didn't feel the German memory context was ready for being really close to it. So the aspect of perpetration, yes, I mean, you have it in quotations like the bombing Holocaust, and it was a memory exhibition. So that's why it looked basically at reception of World War II and of other conflicts of war. And but they really avoided this kind of perpetration thing. The closest the exhibition got to experiencing perpetration was in video games installation. So in a way, and in these video game stations, they had, for example, a British bomber pilot contrasted to somebody on the ground in Germany, and then they had one Holocaust scene in the ghetto in Warsaw. But again, if you looked at it carefully, you couldn't become a real perpetrator. You could become a bystander, but not a perpetrator in the video game. So I think this is super interesting how you provoke with it. I think there was no way in the exhibition you could identify with the bombing Holocaust perspective. That was not possible the way they did it. But of course, they provoked with it in a way in putting these kind of quotations out and showing how memory works and how memory is picked up on the far right, on the one hand, in relation to And of course, one of the weaknesses of a cosmopolitan memory concept clearly is that it doesn't have really an answer. It wants to overcome every form of antagonism. And if you do that, you never understand why we still have lots of racism in the world, while something like the Holocaust doesn't end it in a way. So you cannot really understand how conflicts come and how people become perpetrators. And I think that's one of the most fascinating challenges for public memory and museum representation. How much can we do? Where do we have to just stop? Because yes, a novel might give us a perspective on a perpetrator. A public museum probably, I mean, has different kind of limitations. So.
I see a hand from Anna Topolska.
Okay, yeah. I wanted to ask if you noticed, or would you say there's a difference in this mode of experience in between these big national museums and small local museums, which have been here for many decades, and they still function, and they don't catch up, or not always catch up with this technological development, but they are still here. For example, there are at least 3 small local museums in my hometown, which I'm researching in Poznań. So is there a difference? Would you say there's the difference in this mode of experience in these big museums and in these local museums?
Yes and no. I mean, in a way, so on the one hand, I think that's a great question. Thank you, because we haven't really talked about the fact that I am obviously talking about 12 museums that are either national museums, or at least if they are, some are private, but if they are private, like the one in New Orleans, then they have been symbolically built up to become a national museum, even although they are run privately in a way. And I mean, my local example is the Bastogne War Museum, which is a bit smaller, and it is not a national museum. So it's kind of, but it still had a lot of kind of support in developing the fairly sophisticated technologies they use. So I would, so I think that's a really important aspect. So I think on the one hand, I think experientiality could work for local museums because they are doing more kind of storytelling. So you can bring conflicts out in a different way. They are probably more, or at least they are potentially more independent of these grand narratives. I mean, like, I don't know, you had to tell us what's going on in Poland in a way.
Yeah, exactly. That is something that I noticed, that the Museum of Poznań Army, for example, there's still this exhibit from, like, for 15 years this exhibit has been there, and which focuses now mostly on the experience of individual soldiers in this big battle of Bzura, for which this army was famous. And that was some kind of a shift in this way of commemorating war in the early 90s and early 2000 in Poland, shifting more from these political dimensions to more to this individual experience of the participants of the events, even soldiers. So this still is there, and it's not participating in these big debates that now in Poland are taking place. So that's what I can say on my local example. That yes, I would agree that they are a little bit further from these big narratives. For that reason, this experientiality may work differently a little bit.
Yeah, I think it works probably differently. I think there's a trend in general, so that there have been articles written on that we have in museum representations, this move towards individual perspectives. So I would say you could definitely, I mean, but it still would depend in a way, do we get a grand narrative, or do we get just the kind of multiple perspectives, and do they all become a choir, like I just said, what kind of happens in Berlin in a way, in the Flight and Expulsion Reconciliation kind of center, or do they go in very different directions and are not reconciled? So I would say yes, you can definitely use experientiality there. You probably have to adjust it because of the frame is differently, and the national memory part wouldn't work for it. But there's no real reason, in a way, if we want to understand potentialities, if a visitor comes into this museum, in a way, how do they see visitor experience? Do they immediately identify with the soldier perspective as a collective perspective? or do they immediately are drawn to different individual stories in a way that are told in your museum? And that would kind of give you room to see, in a way, the museum intends to do some collective primary experientiality, or it leaves it open. It's more of a kind of tension, but there is something experiential going on, or it has a master narrative that basically reduces the openness on potentiality for the visitor. But I think it's much more likely that smaller regional museums have more, might either operate in different political debates and different spectrums, or they have potentially more room. I think what you can see is, with the topic of perpetration, so something I have worked on quite a bit, the most interesting installations or exhibitions you are getting are usually special exhibitions, and not the big permanent exhibitions. And that would be the same for a regional museum. I think if they have curators and if they have the kind of infrastructure support for their exhibition, they can potentially do more interesting things than some of these big museums do. So yeah, I'm definitely curious to hear more about museums like the one you're working on. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This museum that I mentioned, the Museum of Poznań Army, this huge political debates were taking and memory frictions were taking place there for many decades until 90s, and then it stopped, and a new exhibition was installed, and it's still there. It's focusing on the experience of the soldiers in the battle. So the viewers are invited to connect with the soldiers as human beings, like they. So this is something, and this is something that I noticed, and the same in the Museum of Armaments, which was in the past the Museum of Liberation of Poznań, of course, taking part in this propaganda, Soviet propaganda of liberation of this of Poznań, of Poland in general, and now it just shifted into the displaying various armaments. So again, it's depoliticized, and so that's what I'm observing. In even a museum of 47, which is the former concentration camp here in Poznań, is also very, but this museum is very much, I would say, exploring the experientiality possibilities of museum, even though it's a very traditional place, it's a memory site. But for example, some theater spectacles are taking place there, who are inviting the viewers to kind of feel, sense, smell this space. So that's what I'm now working on a book on that. So soon we can talk more when I'm finished, when I'm done. So, but that's what I could add here from the local perspective.
Yeah, that sounds great.
That's fascinating. Stephan, I thought I might ask a question that's kind of goes kind of to the root of memory studies, and that's kind of thinking about Pierre Nora and his notion of places of memory, and his concern that that we are propagating these places of memory because we are actually no longer actively remembering. In other words, that we warehouse memory in places and then somehow manage to compartmentalize memory as something we do when we go to a museum and not when we live our day-to-day lives. And this really gets, I guess, at the question of how should we evaluate the effectiveness of museum pedagogy? How can we tell if museums are really what are they teaching lessons? Are they or are they participating in a kind of effort to sort of turn the past into something that is behind closed doors, and the rest of us, our time is spent in a perpetual present?
I I think that, yeah, that's a really important question for the memory studies context. So I think, I mean, they can do both, definitely. And I mean, there are many examples that I do either of them. So in a way, so I think museums can obviously, I mean, most newer museums, they try to narrate, they try to get some kind of context across. In that sense, then the question is, are they just basically a mirror that whatever 10, 15 years behind their historians or behind major developments in cultural memory that then make it into public memory / history in the museum? Or are they actually avant-garde of that and in a way changing in a way the memory through the way they are told? And I think it's always both, but museums can definitely be more dynamic. Of course, we have just talked about, I mean, my book in that sense is restricted to mostly to permanent exhibitions. So which take at least 5 years to develop, often longer in a way. So they are kind of reacting in a way very slowly. I mean, if you really want to, I mean, to really answer that question, I think we have to look, how is the museum operating? What events is it bringing on? How does it perform in guided tours where you obviously can always, my comment is always, give me the most restricted kind of narrative museum in a way you can imagine. As long as it has rich stories and rich material, I can make a great guided tour with it, because you can basically create the multi-perspectivity or so in it. So, and I think that's the same thing. So in a way, you can do that through programming. It's not just the curation of exhibition. So therefore, I would say, I mean, hopefully, I mean, museums today have the chance to be more active, be more performative, be more agents in a way of memory than simply kind of reflectors of putting memory into storage. And that's definitely the role many museum makers see themselves in. Whether that always works is a different story.
And I would add that, of course, as visitors, also the other part of that equation is the visitor, and it's the job of visitors also to come with a critical awareness. And I think, given the growth in tourism as an industry, and I think and the rise of the internet and the availability of information and access to virtual tours, perhaps visitors are also coming to these museums with a more critical conscience, at least some of them, if not all of them, and that becomes looking at that dialogue between visitors and museums. And I think they're a kind of exploration of how permanent exhibits have changed over time, maybe a way to kind of gauge that relationship between the viewing public and the curating entities at the museum.
Yeah, and there's never one answer. So, for example, there is a new exhibition in Berlin, and many of you might have heard about the Humboldt Forum, highly disputed in a way as kind of symbolism of German colonialism and how they deal with it. But I think in the end, and obviously it has a reconstruction of a Prussian castle, which makes it a very stale kind of outside building. But the museum inside is quite exciting, actually, what they in the end did. And in a way, so there's one exhibition that is called Berlin Global, and it brings, that has nothing to do with war, but it shows you how structural experientiality works. So in a way, so it does, it has a room, that's just an example. It's kind of, there's a room that focuses on 5 revolutions in Germany that theoretically, from a historian's point of view, are totally unconnected. They would say, oh, come on, the 1948 revolution, you can't compare that with 1918 or with the 1968 student revolution, and certainly not with 1989 and so on. But at the same time, what the exhibition does, and that requires an open, active visitor. It brings 5 revolutions together. It has other revolutions in other countries on the walls, in a way, of people who moved to Berlin because they basically fled revolutions or experienced revolutions in Syria and other places. And it brings all of these things together. Yes, it's a nightmare for a historian, but it's great for memory studies and for creating structures, because the visitor is, if you want to do anything with it beyond recreating the most basic facts of these revolutions, you have to engage in the stories that are represented there, and connect them and think, okay, how would I become, if I were in this situation, would I be somebody who is part of a revolution? Would I just watch from the side? And then out of the sudden, these revolutions are not that different anymore. And you can start thinking and actively working with it. Who am I in this kind of relation? The exhibition has lots of things on colonialism, racism, and other things where you could ask very similar questions. So, and that's structural experientiality, with the risk that the visitor gets lost in it.
Right, well, that's a museum that I have yet to see, since the pandemic has made travel tricky, but I'm hoping to get there very soon. And I see we're nearing the end of our time, so I just want to make sure anybody else who has a question that they'd like to pose has a chance to do that. It'd be interesting to hear from some of you too about what you're working on in this respect. And while you're thinking, I will just maybe as a sort of final question from me, think about the. I'm curious about the pandemic and what the pandemic has meant for many of these museums, and what have they turned to an online presence? Have they turned to social media in a way to sort of supplement what can't be done in person these days? And do you see any particular trends at work in social media? But again, if anybody has a question, please put your hand up and we'll turn to you.
Yeah, I think the kind of question of the pandemic really opens up a kind of totally new kind of dimension. I'm not sure in a way I can tackle that in a couple of sentences, but it is a fascinating question, because then it creates a question. I mean, similar to what I just had with the video games, which are a very fascinating modern kind of technology tool. So in a way, what do we gain in a way if we out of the sudden are in a virtual space or integrating a virtual space? What do we lose if you can't walk through an exhibition your own way and decide in a way, this is in a way the kind of panel or the kind of display case I want to look at for the object? So I think there are many answers to that. So in a way, how it can on both sides, in a way, how it can help exhibiting or make exhibiting richer or different in a way, but also, of course, how it restricts for what we then miss in a way. I mean, as Dan just said, besides the last 2 weeks where I was in Berlin, in a way, I haven't been really in museums for working in a long time. That's why I worked on TripAdvisor responses and other things of museums I knew very well. And in a way, yes, so you clearly, it's very different being in a museum space again. So, but at the same time, it's also fascinating to what you can explore if you really take the virtual side seriously.
Anastasia, please.
Sorry, I don't want to keep take the floor, and I'm just one thought came to my mind to bring this discussion to what we started with. How can we explain this huge race of popularity of memory of World War II museums? I was just thinking that maybe we might consider thinking beyond politics and think about practicalities, because I find it fascinating that in your book, Stephan, you do mention that only 2 of those museums were strictly object-based. So it is with, and again, bringing us back to the pandemic and post-pandemic situation, we also have multimedia, right? And also digital Holocaust studies. So there is a special subfield that actually discusses this. Yeah, what do we do and how do we remember? How do we bring it without the objects in the virtual reality? But it's also, so what I'm saying is that there is technology to tell these stories without bringing a tank.
Yes, yes. No, I think that's a very important dimension here. I would say actually objects play a big role in a way in many, not in all, but in quite a few of the museums, but they are curated objects. So in a way, so they have to be in a narrative context. I mean, as far as I understand, without having seen it, the London part, there's still far too much pandemic of risking traveling between Germany and the UK, and they both have their pandemic issues. So I didn't do that in a way by being here. But the new exhibition in the Empirical Museum, which Dan mentioned, which just opened a month ago, it praises itself. I mean, with the fact that, I mean, it has been reviewed by in the press as a fairly multi-perspective kind of exhibition that tries to bring different perspectives to it. And often these perspectives are connected to objects in a way, to one object that can then be told or contextualized by different people in different roles. Sometimes it's more tensions, sometimes it's less tensions and more a choir of voices. But I think that's in a way, but I think the object still has a big role here. I mean, especially if we have less and less real living eyewitnesses, then objects. I mean, some exhibitions might be able to do it without objects, but I think war exhibitions. I mean, there will always. I mean, it might be not. You have to have 10 tanks in there to have a convincing exhibition, so that, or at least not the ones which I looked at, which were more narrative based. But it's still. I mean, objects still play a major role, and it's very interesting if you look. I actually just wrote an article on kind of objects and progress and basically, or the ambiguities of memory in the representation of objects. And it's the same thing. I mean, some objects become basically the symbol of a certain narrative and a certain thing. Other objects become the demonstration of ambiguity, and you can read them from this angle. And then if you look at this and you see, I mean, very straightforward example is a V2, whether you look at it as a kind of Nazi ultimate weapon in a way with kind of killed and destroyed people, whether you look at it from how it was used, I mean, how it was produced in a way in concentration camp conditions, whether you look at it from the American narrative of using basically the rocket technology in a way and further developing it in the Cold War. There are so many fascinating angles, and that's actually something where you can make objects more than we are just looking at them as a classical military symbol. We can use them for very diverse stories in a way, or curate them for very diverse stories if we have the right object.
Thanks. Well, I see that we are at the end of our time. So I would just like to say thank you to Stephan for the book, of course, and for the opportunity to discuss it, and to the organizers, Anastasia and your fellow organizers, Misha and others. It's been a pleasure, and I hope we can meet in person someday. That would also be nice. So thank you very much.
Yeah, so thank you, everybody. And if you have any questions you want to have individually, please feel free to email me. It's just my name, stephan.jaeger@humanitoba.ca. So in a way, so feel free to email in a way if you didn't want to have the comments in this big Zoom discussion, but in a way have comments or whatever on the book or on our discussion or on anything else in a way. I'm happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Buy the book. It's affordable.
Buy the book or download the book in a way, whatever you want to do. All right.
Good.
And also, we would like to invite everyone for our next seminar on January 10th, when we will discuss the book by Daniela Koleva, who was here also with us today, and the book that was published recently in Bulgarian, Memory and Justice, Personal Reminiscences and Public Narratives of Communism. So this will be the topic of our next seminar in January. So,
Great, thank you.
Wonderful.
Okay, goodbye, everybody.
Yeah, bye. Everybody.
Bye.